Okay. Still 19th century, but a slightly, extremely different thread from the 19th century. But still one that I think is symptomatic of the anxieties and stresses and tensions of the time. I wanted to talk about a sort of small part of my research project, which came out of the diseases of modern life, which looks at, in a whole, literature in the senses, but particularly literature and listening and new understandings of auditory thresholds in the 19th century and speculation about what lay beyond those thresholds. And so, in the extra Christmas number of his weekly literary magazine, All the Year Round, in 1859, Dickens's opening story, The Mortals in the House, included a declaration that the early morning, just before daybreak, was the narrator's most ghostly time. Any house, Dickens writes, would be more or less haunted to me in the early morning, and a haunted house could scarcely address me to greater advantage then. And the reason Dickens gives for the ghostly nature of this transitional moment between night and day, between sleeping and waking, is not only the associated potential for confusion of mind as it wakes from sleep, but also because he considers the act of sleeping itself to be a kind of impassive state that anticipates what he calls that mysterious condition to which we are all tending. The tranquility of the hour, he says, is the tranquility of death. Even a certain air that familiar household objects take upon them when they first emerge from the shadows of the night into the morning, or being newer, and as they used to be long ago, has its counterpart in the subsidence of the worn face of maturity or age in death into the old youthful look. For Dickens, then, at this hour, the state of the world, the state of the mind emerging from sleep is fundamentally associated with mortality. And for Dickens, it facilitates the possibility of crossing between different states of being. It was at this hour, Dickens writes, that he once saw an apparition of his dead father. He was alive and well, sitting with his back towards me on a seat that stood beside my bed. His head was resting on his hands, and whether he was slumbering or grieving, I could not discern. Amazed to see him there, I sat up, moved my position, leaned out of bed, and watched him. As he did not move then, I became alarmed, and laid my hand upon his shoulder, as I thought, and there was no such thing. So even in the spectral image of his father, there's a confusion between grief and sleeping that I think is most telling, and suggestive of the possibilities that might come to an altered, a troubled, a grieving mind. And Dickens, of course, famously enjoyed night walking, which Matthew can tell you far more about than I can. But it's often romantically cast as part of Dickens's relationship with the City of London. But after our wonderful keynote this morning, I think it's worth raising as the potential disruption to his sleep-wake cycle might be a contributing factor to these experiences. Nonetheless, a few years earlier, in 1855, again in a Christmas number, this time of his periodical Household Words, Dickens recorded another early morning spectral encounter, which is narrated as Michael Slater has written under the thinnest of fictional disguises, mingling autobiography and fancy in his reminiscences of his beloved sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth. So the inspiration for several literary characters, including Little Nell in The Old Curiosity Shop and Rose Maylie in Oliver Twist, Mary Hogarth had died in Dickens's arms when she was only 17. The scientist and critic George Henry Lewis claimed that Dickens had confided in him that after Mary died, her image had not only haunted him by day, but for 12 months she visited his dreams every night. And a story called The Holly Tree, the male narrator refers to the death of a very near and dear friend of whom he has dreamt many times since her passing, and whom he encounters through a very strange auditory experience one morning in Italy. I was in Italy and awoke, or seemed to awake, the well-remembered voice distinctly in my ears, conversing with it. I entreated it as it rose above my bed, and soared up to the vaulted roof of the old room to answer me a question I had asked, touching the future life. My hands were still outstretched towards it as it vanished, when I heard a bell ringing by the garden wall and a voice in the deep stillness of the night calling on all good Christians to pray for the souls of the dead, it being All Souls' Eve. It's impossible to determine how literally Dickens meant that he was able to see or to hear his loved ones in these instances, or to what extent he felt able to control these various manifestations or hauntings of his mind by these figures. He did not, unlike the spiritualists, attribute it to an external agency. But they were undoubtedly intense psychological experiences which posit a fascinating relationship, I think, between grieving, sleeping, and visions of the dead. And for spiritualists, dreams, unlike many of the other papers this morning, are profoundly important moments of insight into the future, into the realm of the spirits, into deeper truths. And Dickens's openness regarding his psychological experiences, his clear fascination with phantoms and revenants, as well as his production of more than 24 ghost stories throughout his career, rendered both his life and work particularly fertile ground for 19th century spiritualist interpretations, as well as the active promotion of a spiritualist agenda. They repeatedly insisted that Dickens was a medium, even though he would have none of it. Spiritualist periodicals across Britain and America frequently reproduce these two and other accounts of Dickens's voice hearing and ghost seeing, claiming that not only was he privately sympathetic to the spiritualist cause, but that he was an exceptionally gifted medium who was finely attuned to the voices and the spirit presences in the world around him. And numerous accounts of spiritualist mediumship in this period emphasize the loss of conscious control, physical and mental, which was necessary to render oneself a passive vessel for the spirit world. So Dickens's emphasis on the act of sleeping and the suspension of his consciousness, which gave rise to these encounters, is seized upon by the spiritualist press as evidence of his instrumentality. Thus, when an anonymous article entitled "Mediumship Amongst Eminent Literary Men," and most of them were claimed to be mediums, which appeared in the Spiritual magazine in 1872, declared that Dickens was not only an impressional medium, but he was clairaudient when awake and clairvoyant in his dreams. So he could hear spirits when conscious and could see the dead while he was asleep. Dickens's name is regularly cited in articles on creative inspiration and supernatural voices throughout the 19th century, just in the spiritualist press. And his works were taken up and analysed as vessels of wonderful revelations from the spirit world. This particular description of his early morning encounter with the ghost of Mary Hogarth was taken up by the Spiritual magazine, which noted that it was very much in keeping with the manifestations of seance goers. Things like the audible detection of bells, of voices and music are recorded by many spiritualists as taking place in the early hours of the morning. This is taken as evidence not of the potential psychological dimension of spiritual experience, but of Dickens's own unacknowledged mediumship. Another 1870 article called "Some Passages from the Writings of Dickens" situates his experience alongside similar accounts from the diary of the spiritualist A.C. Swinton, letters by the well-known author William Carpenter, and Mrs. Newton Crossland's 1857 spiritualist memoir, Light in the Valley. Through these continual comparisons to spiritualist writings, Dickens is explicitly being situated at the threshold of the spiritual and material realms, sensitive to the pulsations and vibrations that are emanating, they say, not from his own mind, but from external agencies while his consciousness is suspended. His work, fiction and non-fiction alike, was therefore understood to contain, embedded within their more manifest stories and topics, unconsciously expressed spiritual truths or revelations that his rational mind rejected. And through these debates, I would suggest Dickens's work emerges as a site in which the complexities surrounding the operations of the sleeping and the semi-conscious mind were being examined and negotiated in wider culture. That Dickens harboured a lifelong attraction to the occult and the supernatural is evidenced by his adolescent fondness for the terrific Register, which was a penny magazine filled with fairly gruesome tales of murder, torture, and otherworldly apparitions, as well as the recurrence of ghostly figures throughout much of his own fiction. It is well documented that he attended seances, he experimented with table turning, he practiced mesmerism, and in the 1860s he joined the London Ghost Club, which was founded in 1863 to promote organised research into the potential nature and existence of ghosts. Nonetheless, Dickens's almost instinctive attraction to psychic phenomena and his eagerness, even desire to believe in the existence of ghosts, was consistently curbed by his need for sufficient supporting evidence. He was familiar with the work on spectral delusions and optical illusions that was being undertaken at the time by, for example, the Scottish physician John Ferrier in his Essay Towards a Theory of Apparitions, the English writer Samuel Hibbett's Sketches of the Philosophy of Apparitions, and the Scottish physicist David Brewster's Letters on Natural Magic. Dickens insisted it was necessary to rule out the possibility of any sensory or neurological disorder on the part of mediums or witnesses, which is known, he said, to be a common disease of many phases. He consistently insisted that through their role as intermediaries between the self and its environment, the senses and the nervous system were understood to be frequent causes of disease, stress, distress, and disorientation, which give rise to experiences of the eerie, the uncanny, and the grotesque. Dickens actively participated in contemporary controversies about ghosts, presenting his readers with detailed scientific, medical, and technological expositions on the potential nature of supernatural phenomena. Throughout his periodicals, he maintained a dynamic mixture of information and entertainment regarding this subject. So alongside the publication of ghost stories by figures such as Wilkie Collins, Edward Bulwer Lytton, and Sheridan Le Fanu, he included many speculative pieces on organic disease, nervous sensitivities, hallucination, magnetism, and the effects of electricity, light, and chemical substances. He was at times openly contemptuous of spiritualist practices. In his 1858 article, Well-Authenticated Rappings, the speaker recounts 3 experiences of unaccountable spirit rapping that he is convinced are of spiritual origin. However, he then discovers the first was the port he consumed the evening before. Secondly, that his pork pie contained lead, which seems like far more to worry about than seeing things. Finally, he witnesses a case of table turning, which is revealed to be the diversionary tactic of a young man endeavouring to pass a letter to his beloved. Such complaints had, of course, already been put forward by Ebenezer Scrooge in Dickens's Christmas Carol, who, in his semi-conscious state between waking and sleeping, doubts the evidence of his senses because he knows that a little thing affects them, that a slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats, such that the apparition of Marley may be the result of an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. And similarly, in his ghost story, The Chimes, the protagonist Toby Veck dozes by the fire after eating tripe for dinner, before experiencing a series of visions which he is forced to watch helpless to interfere, but when he later awakes to the sound of the Christmas bells, his daughter warns him he should not eat tripe in future without consulting a doctor as to whether it agrees with him. But Dickens is a keen explorer of the dialogue between consciousness and the world, and between the conscious and sleeping or unconscious mind. And we might turn to his own ghost stories in light of this as illustrative of those possibilities suggested not only by digestive and bodily disorders, but by altered or troubled states of mind. And the form of the ghost story, I think, mirrors his explorations of the workings of that conscious and semi-conscious mind. And I've chosen A Christmas Carol partly because of the season, but partly because I think most of us will be familiar with the narrative. And there is, I think, more to the appearance of Jacob Marley than a blot of mustard or a crumb of cheese. For Scrooge's visionary sequence in A Christmas Carol revolves around his memories of Marley on Christmas Eve, which is the anniversary of his death. The two gentlemen who visit asking for charitable support explicitly mention Marley and bring him to the front of Scrooge's mind. His nephew's visit then provides a tangible connection to Scrooge's dead sister, and he's living in the chambers that once belonged to his deceased partner, so there are material traces of Marley's existence always around him. And he sits by the fire, eating his gruel, notably prepared because he has a cold in his head, and meditating upon the day's events, and sensations from the present become interwoven with ideas from the past. And it is those ideas and memories and emotions that provide the content of his visions, that become the relic, to use the word from earlier, of the ghost's manifestations. And there's a parallel moment in the chimes when Toby Veck is falling asleep by the fire and he reads the newspaper and comes across the story of a young woman who has taken her own life and the life of her child, and declares that such a thing is unnatural and cruel and that none but people who are bad at heart could do such deeds. But then has a series of visions involving his own daughter placed in such a situation, and comes to realise the moral consequences of his acceptance of current social structures. And, as in almost all Dickens's ghost stories, these spectral visions manifest at night or in the early morning, when the seer occupies this changed state of consciousness. It's a transformative time of day for Dickens, a time when the mind wanders, when uncertainty lurks, when the repressed begins to take over. And Dickens opens his ghost story, The Haunted Man, by introducing that time of day very explicitly as the time of ghosts. And it's several pages long, but this is the most salient part. When twilight everywhere released the shadows, prisoned up the day, that now closed in and gathered like mustering swarms of ghosts, when they stood lowering in corners of rooms and frowning out from behind half-open doors, when these shadows brought into the minds of older people other thoughts and showed them different images, when they stole from their retreats in the likenesses of forms and faces from the past, from the grave, from the deep, deep gulf where the things that might have been and never were are always wondering. So what Dickens is describing here, I think, in very poetic language of shadows and darkness, is the mysterious workings of the human mind, the mind's capacity for altered states of consciousness. Figured here is the infiltration and possession of the subject's normal self by shadows, by ghosts, by other thoughts. Thoughts that ultimately emerge in Dickens's view from the promptings of the subconscious self, which is somehow strangely freed at this time of day when the subject is or is falling asleep. And when he wakes after his encounter with Jacob Marley by his fireside, if we accept as I'm proposing that he dozes off by the fireside, the persistent question in Ebenezer Scrooge's mind is, was it a dream or not? That changed state of consciousness seems to become the critical factor in allowing Scrooge to overcome his normal miserly habits, to allow a temporary absence of volitional control, through which repressed guilt as to his past, repressed anxiety as to his future, indeed stress as to his future, might manifest. And in pitch darkness, he's unable to discern even the windows from the walls of his chambers. He's utterly disoriented. He's lost all sense of time. And he even posits the notion that there are no days to count by. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, but then it is London, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off day and taken possession of the world. Any effort to exercise his will or his agency to resist the demands of his successive spirit visitants is, it seems, futile. Scrooge is not in control of these visions, and the drawing aside of the curtains, not the narrator notes the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed, that brings him face to face with his first unearthly visitant, the ghost of Christmas past, represents in very literal language, I think, the crossing of a threshold, the piercing of a veil, the drawing back of a curtain between worlds. Just as his first vision of Marley takes place on the threshold as he stands at the door of his own chambers. So when the curtain is drawn back, his mind is attuned to things and to people beyond his usual consciousness. and his final movement back into consciousness is also signified by the curtain. As finally in distress he reaches out to grasp the robes of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, a scene that always terrified me as a child, holding out his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed. He saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. He suddenly seems able to intervene in this realm, in this dream, we might say, to act with a conscious will. It seems to me to be describing a process of waking up. So the ghosts of Christmas time seem to point to the psychological depths of Dickens's protagonists. For Dickens, the dreamscape, the access it grants to the phantoms of the mind, is tightly bound up with social ills, with memories of past selves, past opportunities, perhaps lost opportunities. And although the spiritualist movement seized on these tales as evidence of Dickens's own ability to draw back the curtain between this world and the next, and even attempted to channel Dickens multiple times after his death, we might, I think, be more prudent to take Dickens's own advice, which is given at the end of his story, The Chimes, when he asks whether Toby Veck has dreamed his visions by the fire on Christmas Eve. Or are his joys and sorrows and the actors in them but a dream? Himself a dream, the teller of this tale, a dreamer, waking but now. If it be so, O listener, dear to him in all his visions, try to bear in mind the stern realities from which these shadows come. And in your sphere, none is too wide and none too limited for such an end. Endeavour to correct, improve, and soften them. I'll leave it there.